Imagine being free. After months, maybe years of barbed wire, cold barracks, and watery soup, you are finally running through the woods in the dark, heart pounding, lungs burning, every footstep feeling like a miracle. You made it out. You actually made it out. And then the sirens start. That sound, that horrible wailing in the distance, meant that the Germans knew. And for 50 of the bravest men who ever lived, that sound was the beginning of the end. Not the end of captivity. The end of everything. This is not just a story about a prison break. This is a story about what happened after. This is the story of the Great Escape, yes, but more importantly, this is the story of the 50 Allied airmen who were recaptured and then, in cold blood, murdered on the direct orders of Adolf Hitler himself. These were not soldiers killed in battle. They were prisoners of war, protected by the Geneva Convention, unarmed and helpless. And they were executed anyway. My name is your guide through one of the most haunting chapters of the Second World War. And I want you to understand something before we begin. The men we are going to talk about today were real people. They had mothers and fathers. They had wives and sweethearts back home. Some of them had children who would never see their fathers walk through the front door again. They were engineers and doctors and farmers and teachers who had volunteered to fly into the most dangerous skies in human history. And when they were shot down and captured, they refused to stop fighting. They used their minds and their hands and their courage to dig one of the most ambitious escape tunnels in the history of warfare. And for that courage, 50 of them paid the ultimate price. So sit back, because this story deserves to be told slowly, carefully, and with the full weight of everything it carries. Let us go back to the beginning, to understand what happened on that terrible night in March of 1944, and in the weeks that followed, we have to understand the world that these men were living in. By 1943, the air war over Europe was an absolute nightmare. The Allied bombing campaigns were pounding German cities, rail lines, and industrial centers. But getting those bombers to their targets and back was costing a staggering price in human life. American and British aircrew were being shot down at rates that would seem almost unbelievable today. A bomber crew member in the early days of the war had, statistically speaking, a very poor chance of completing a full tour of missions without being killed or captured. When airmen were shot down and survived, they became prisoners of war. The Germans, to their partial credit at this stage of the war, generally followed the rules of the Geneva Convention when it came to captured Allied officers. There were exceptions, of course, and we will get to those. But in the main, officer POWs were sent to dedicated camps called Stalags, and the most famous of these, the one that housed the greatest concentration of Allied airmen, was Stalag Luft 3. Stalag Luft 3 sat in what was then Germany, in the region of Silesia, near a town called Sagan. Today that area is part of Western Poland. The camp was built by the Germans with the specific intention of making escape almost impossible. They chose the location deliberately. Sagan was deep in German territory, hundreds of miles from any neutral border. Even if you made it out of the camp, you still had to somehow cross the entire width of a country that was at war, where every civilian was a potential informer and every policeman and soldier would be looking for you. The Germans also built the camp with escape prevention in mind. They raised the barracks on wooden stilts so that any tunneling activity would be visible from the surface. They buried seismic microphones in the ground around the perimeter to detect the vibrations of digging. They had watchtowers with searchlights. They had guards called ferrets, specially trained men whose only job was to look for escape attempts. They installed trip wires in the dirt. They built a warning wire inside the outer fence that prisoners were forbidden to cross. In short, the Germans looked at this place and said, "Nobody is getting out of here." They were wrong. The man who decided they were wrong was a Royal Air Force officer named Roger Bushell. He was a South African by birth, a lawyer by training, a ski champion and rugby player, and one of the most formidable personalities to ever walk through the gates of a German prison camp. Bushell had already escaped twice before arriving at Stalag Luft 3. After his second escape attempt, the Gestapo had given him what they called a serious warning. He understood exactly what that meant. If he was caught again, the normal rules might not apply to him. He knew the risk. He did not care. When Bushell arrived at Stalag Luft 3, he immediately began organizing what would become the most sophisticated, the most ambitious, and the most meticulously planned escape operation in the history of prisoner of war camps. He called his organization the X-Organization, and it was structured like a military unit because that is exactly what it was. Bushell had a vision, not just to escape. Everybody in that camp wanted to escape. His vision was something far more audacious. He wanted to dig not one tunnel but 3 simultaneous tunnels. 3 at the same time. The idea was that if the Germans found 1 or even 2 of the tunnels, the third might still succeed. He named the tunnels Tom, Dick, and Harry. And then he organized the entire camp, hundreds and eventually more than 600 men, into a single coordinated machine, all working toward the same goal. Think about the scale of that for a moment. More than 600 Allied airmen, living under constant surveillance, in a camp specifically designed to prevent escape, working in total secrecy to dig 3 separate tunnels, each one 30 feet deep and stretching more than 300 feet to reach beyond the perimeter fence. The logistics were staggering. To dig, they needed tools. Tools meant stealing or fabricating metal objects. The camp carpenters built wooden frames to shore up the tunnel walls. But wood had to come from somewhere. Prisoners began removing boards from the underside of their bunks, carefully, one at a time, hoping the guards would not notice. By the time the tunnels were complete, they had removed something like 4,000 bed boards from the barracks. They needed light in the tunnels. Electricity was out of the question. So the prisoners made fat lamps, little dishes filled with margarine with a pajama cord as a wick. They produced a small, steady flame. They also tapped into the camp's electrical system at certain points, a feat of engineering that required considerable ingenuity. They needed fresh air pumped into the tunnels as the diggers worked. So they built pumps, bellows made from kit bags and wooden frames, connected to air pipes made from tin cans soldered together. Those tin cans came from the Red Cross food parcels that the prisoners received. Every empty tin was saved and repurposed. They needed a way to dispose of the dirt. This is where the operation became almost surreal in its creativity. The dirt from underneath Stalag Luft 3 was a particular problem because it was a distinctive sandy yellow color, completely unlike the gray surface soil of the compound. If anyone saw yellow dirt, they would know immediately that digging was happening. The solution was a group of men known as the Penguins. The Penguins wore specially designed bags inside their trousers, bags that could hold dirt, suspended from their belts, with a cord running down to a pin at the ankle. A penguin would walk out into the compound, find a patch of ground where the yellow dirt would not be noticed, pull the cord, and let the dirt trickle out of his trouser leg as he walked. They disposed of hundreds of thousands of pounds of earth this way, a little at a time, day after day, right under the noses of the German guards. They built a forging operation that produced false identity papers of extraordinary quality. They built a tailoring shop that converted military uniforms into civilian clothing. They gathered maps and compasses. They stockpiled food, German currency, and civilian clothing. They had men whose entire job was to distract or delay the German ferrets when they came into the compound to search. They had lookouts at every corner. They had a language system, a word called goon for a German guard, and when the call went out that a goon was coming, the entire operation would cease within seconds, and every man would be doing something completely innocent when the guard arrived. It was, by any measure, one of the greatest organizational achievements in the history of warfare. And it was all done by men who had no tools, no resources, no freedom, and no real reason to believe they would ever make it home. By the spring of 1944, only one of the 3 tunnels was still active. Tom had been discovered by the Germans. Dick had been converted into a storage space. But Harry was nearly complete. On the night of March the 24th, 1944, the escape committee decided it was time. The tunnel was ready. The men who had been selected to go through were briefed and equipped. They had their false papers. They had their civilian clothes. They had their cover stories memorized in German. The plan was to get 200 men out. 200 Allied airmen, vanishing into the German night, spreading chaos across the German interior, flooding the countryside with escapees, forcing the Germans to divert huge amounts of manpower from the war effort to search for them. That was the plan. Here is what actually happened. The tunnel exit was not quite as far as they had hoped. When the first man opened the exit hatch and climbed out, He found himself still just inside the tree line, not as deep into the woods as they needed. He was dangerously close to the perimeter lights. Then there was a blizzard. The snow slowed everything down. The tunnel itself had problems. The rope signaling system that was supposed to tell the men waiting underground when it was safe to move forward kept malfunctioning. Men were getting stuck at the exit point, lying in the snow, exposed, waiting for the clear signal that kept not coming. Despite all of this, 76 men made it out of the tunnel before it was discovered. In the early hours of March the 25th, a guard happened to walk past the exit point just as a man was climbing out of the ground. He raised the alarm. The escape was over. 76 men were out. 73 were eventually recaptured. 3 made it home. 3 men out of 76 made it all the way through Germany and back to Allied control. They are known as the Home Run 3, and they are remarkable. But the story of the other 73, and particularly the 50, is the one that cuts deepest. When Adolf Hitler heard about the escape, he was furious. Absolutely, violently furious. He was in his headquarters in East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair, and by several accounts he raged in a way that frightened even his senior staff. This was March of 1944. The war was going badly. The Eastern Front was crumbling. The Allied invasion of France was clearly coming. And now, right in the heart of the Reich, more than 70 Allied prisoners had made him look like a fool. Hitler's initial response, according to testimony given after the war, was to demand that all of the recaptured escapees be shot. All of them, every single man. His senior officers, including Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, and Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, pushed back. Executing all 73 recaptured prisoners would be an undeniable war crime. It would be a violation of the Geneva Convention so blatant that it could have serious consequences, both militarily and politically. Göring in particular argued strongly against it.
Hitler compromised.
And that word, compromised, is almost too gentle for what he actually decided. His compromise was to murder 50 of the recaptured men. Not all of them, just 50. As if somehow killing 50 men instead of 73 made it acceptable. As if there were a number below which cold-blooded murder became something other than what it was. The order went out through the Gestapo. 50 of the recaptured escapees were to be taken from custody, driven to isolated locations, and shot. It was to be made to look like they were attempting to escape again. The cover story was ready before the murders were even committed. The official German announcement would say that the men had been shot while attempting to re-escape during transport. It was a lie, and everyone involved knew it was a lie, and they did it anyway. Now I want to stop here, because I want you to understand what the next section of this story really means. We are about to go through the names and the stories of the 50 men who were murdered. I am not going to rush through this. These were individual human beings. They deserve to have their names said out loud, their stories told, their faces remembered. The first of the 50 to be murdered was Roger Bushel himself, the man who had organized the entire operation. He was driven out of the city of Saarbrücken on March the 29th, 1944, just 4 days after the tunnel was discovered. He was with a French officer named Bernard Schiedhauer. Both men were ordered out of the car at a remote location. They were shot from behind. The Gestapo man who did it later told his superiors that the prisoners had attempted to escape while being transported. Nobody with any sense believed it. But the paperwork was filed and the bodies were buried, and that was that. Bushel was 33 years old. He never saw South Africa again. He never finished his law career. He never got to tell the story of the greatest escape in history. He was shot in the back on a German roadside by men who murdered him on the orders of a man who could not stand the embarrassment of having been outsmarted. Squadron leader Ian Cross was captured near Sagan and murdered on March the 29th. He was 30 years old. Squadron leader Roger Bushel, as I said, died the same day. Flight Lieutenant Henry Birkland was a Canadian. He had been a wheat farmer in Saskatchewan before the war. He was shot near Gorlitz on the same day, March 29th. He was 28 years old. Flight Lieutenant Leslie Broderick was a New Zealander. He was murdered near Hirschberg on March 29th. He was 26 years old. Flight Lieutenant Carol Wiley Byers was an American. He came from Ohio. He was shot near Breslau on the 29th of March. He was 24 years old. Flight Lieutenant Michael Casey was an Irishman flying with the RAF. He was murdered near Danzig on March the 29th. He was 28. Wing Commander James Catanack was an Australian. He had grown up in Victoria and trained as a pilot before the war. He was shot on March the 29th near Kiel. He was 23 years old. 23. Flight Lieutenant Arnold Christensen was a New Zealander. He was murdered on March the 29th near Kiel. He was 24 years old. Dennis Cochran was a flight lieutenant in the RAF. He was shot near Saarbrücken on March the 29th. He was 23 years old. Squadron leader Neville Magar was a South African. He was murdered on March the 29th. He was 27. Each of these men, and the 40 who would follow in the days and weeks after, had families who would receive a brief official notification from the Red Cross or the British government. Missing, presumed dead, or simply killed during escape attempt. That was it. That was all the families got for months. The full truth would not come out until after the war. Let us continue through the full accounting of the 50, because every name deserves to be spoken. Flight Lieutenant Paweł Tobalski was a Polish officer, one of many Poles flying with the RAF after their own country had been overrun. He was murdered near Stettin on March the 29th. He was 30 years old. Flight Lieutenant John Poe was a New Zealander of Maori descent, one of the few non-white officers in the camp. He was murdered near Hirschberg on March the 29th. He was 28. Flight Lieutenant Henri Picard was a Belgian. He had escaped from occupied Belgium to join the RAF. He was shot near Saarbrücken on March the 29th. He was 29. Flight Lieutenant Tony Hayter was British. He was murdered near Gorlitz on March the 29th. He was 24. Flight Lieutenant Alistair MacDonald was a New Zealander. He was shot on March 29th near Hirschberg. He was 26. Squadron leader Thomas Kirby Green was British and had spent part of his childhood in Africa. He was murdered near Zlin in Czechoslovakia on March the 29th. He was 25. Flight Lieutenant Gordon Kidder was a Canadian. He was shot with Kirby Green near Zlin. He was 29. Flight Lieutenant Antoni Kunarski was Polish. He was murdered on March the 29th. He was 34. Flight Lieutenant Per Bergsland. Bergsland was actually one of the three who made it home, one of the home run three. Let me continue with those who were murdered. Flight Lieutenant Romas Marcinkus was Lithuanian, born in Kaunas, and had joined the RAF via Britain. He was murdered near Stettin on March the 29th. He was 31. Flight Lieutenant Włodzimierz Kolanowski was another Polish officer. He was shot on March the 29th. He was 26. Flight Lieutenant Jerzy Monshine was Polish. He was murdered on March the 29th. He was 29. Flight Lieutenant Sotiris Skanziklas was a Greek officer flying with the RAF. He was shot on March the 29th. He was 26. Flight Lieutenant Brian Evans was a Welshman. He was murdered on March the 29th near Sagan. He was 26. Flight Lieutenant Johannes Gauss was a South African. He was shot on March the 29th. He was 26. Flight Lieutenant Cyril Swain was British. He was murdered on March the 29th. He was 29. Flight Lieutenant Nicola Luda was a Romanian officer flying with the Allied forces. He was shot on March the 29th. He was 30. Flying Officer Freddy Dvorak was Czechoslovakian. He had fled his occupied country to fight for freedom with the RAF. He was murdered on March the 29th. He was 28. Flying Officer Robert Stewart was British. He was shot on March the 29th. He was 26. Flight Lieutenant Michael Shand was a New Zealander. He was murdered on March the 29th. He was 25. Flight Lieutenant George McGill was a Canadian. He was shot near Danzig on March the 29th. He was 25. Flight Lieutenant William Grisman was British. He was murdered on March the 29th. He was 24. Flight Lieutenant Alistair Gunn was British. He was shot on March the 29th. He was 23. Flight Lieutenant Harold Milford was British. He was murdered on the 29th of March near Leipzig. He was 29. Flight Lieutenant Edgar Humphreys was British. He was shot on March the 29th near Nuremberg. He was 24. Flight Lieutenant Ernst Valenta was a Czech officer flying with the RAF. He was murdered on March the 29th. He was 26. Flight Lieutenant Hieronymus Prinsep was South African. He was shot on the 29th of March. He was 30. Flight Lieutenant Leonard Trent had actually been awarded the Victoria Cross earlier in the war for an extraordinarily brave low-level attack on a German target. He survived the massacre and was not among the 50 killed. But the fact that even a Victoria Cross recipient could be captured and held prisoner shows you the kind of men who were in that camp. Flight Lieutenant Anthony Bethel was British. He was murdered on March the 29th. He was 22 years old. 22. Flight Lieutenant Gilbert Wiley Ogilvy was British. He was shot on March the 29th. He was 27. Squadron Leader Lawrence Reavel Carter was British. He was murdered on March the 29th. He was 31. Flight Lieutenant Kazimierz Pawlik was Polish. He was shot on March the 29th. He was 28. Flying Officer John Stower was British and had been born in Argentina. He was murdered on March the 29th. He was 26. Flight Lieutenant Rupert Stevens was South African. He was shot near Natzweiler in France on the 31st of March. He was 31. Flight Lieutenant Robert Bien was Polish-born and American-raised. He was murdered on the 6th of April. He was 25. Flight Lieutenant Włodzimierz Nowakowski was Polish. He was shot on the 6th of April. He was 29. Flight Lieutenant Patrick Langford was a Canadian. He was murdered on the 6th of April. He was 25. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Nelson was a Canadian. He was shot on the 6th of April. He was 24. Squadron Leader John Williams was an Australian. He was murdered on the 6th of April. He was 33. Flight Lieutenant Reginald Kirith was an Australian. He was shot on the 6th of April. He was 28. Flight Lieutenant Anthony Hayter was British. He was murdered on the 6th of April. He was 24. Squadron Leader Christoph Langlois van Voorden was Dutch. He had escaped from occupied Holland to join the Allied cause. He was shot on the 6th of April. He was 29. And so it went. Over the course of several weeks, in dribs and drabs, in 2s and 3s and 4s, 50 men were taken from custody and shot. The murders were spread out over time, partly to conceal the scale of what was happening, and partly because it took time to process the logistics of murder on this scale while also running a world war. The youngest of the 50 was 22 years old. The oldest was 36. The average age was about 26. These were young men who should have had their whole lives ahead of them. They came from Britain, from Australia, from Canada, from New Zealand, from South Africa, from Poland, from Belgium, from Czechoslovakia, from Norway, from Lithuania, from the United States, from Greece, from Romania, and from the Netherlands. The Great Escape was not just a British story. It was an Allied story. And the murder of the 50 was a crime against not one nation, but many. Back at the camp, the men who had not escaped and the men who had been recaptured and returned to the camp were living in a state of terrible suspense. They knew that something was wrong. The numbers did not add up. They could count how many men had been returned to the camp, and they could see that many men were missing. The Germans were not saying anything useful. Then the urns started arriving. This is one of the most grotesque details of the entire story. The Germans cremated the bodies of the murdered men and sent their ashes back to Stalag Luft 3 in small urns, accompanied by brief official notifications stating that the men had been shot while attempting to escape. The men in the camp looked at those urns and they knew. Even before any investigation was done, even before any confession was made, they knew. Their friends had not been shot while trying to escape. They had been murdered. The timing, the manner, the ridiculous official explanation, none of it made any sense unless you accepted the truth that the Germans had simply executed them. Senior British officer group Captain Herbert Massey, who ran the British POW organization within the camp, formally protested to the German camp authorities. He demanded an explanation. He demanded that the full circumstances of each death be investigated. The Germans stonewalled. They repeated the official line. The men had been shot while attempting to re-escape. Massey was outraged. and he was already planning what would happen when the war was over. He began secretly compiling a record of every name, every urn, every date, every location given in the official German notifications. He and other senior officers gathered every piece of information they could, wrote it down in hiding, and made sure that copies were stored in multiple locations so that if the Germans tried to confiscate the records, not everything would be lost. They were building the foundation of a war crimes case, inside a prisoner of war camp, under the noses of the men who had committed the crimes. The 3 men who made it home had an extraordinary story to tell when they arrived back in Britain. They were Bram van der Stok, a Dutch pilot, Per Bergsland and Jens Meller, both Norwegians. They had taken different routes and by different means managed to reach neutral territory. Van der Stok via Spain, Bergsland and Meller by boat from Sweden. When they got back to Britain and reported what had happened, the information went all the way to Winston Churchill. The British government was deeply alarmed, not just because of the immediate tragedy, but because of what it signaled about the nature of the Nazi regime in the later stages of the war. If the Germans were willing to murder 50 unarmed prisoners of war in cold blood, what else were they doing? The British government made a formal statement in the House of Commons. Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, stood up in Parliament and announced that the British government knew that the deaths of these men were not the result of escape attempts but were cold-blooded murders. He promised that those responsible would be brought to justice. This was not just a formality. It was a promise made publicly that the British government intended to keep. The war ended in May of 1945, and almost before the last shots were fired, the investigation began. The RAF established a special unit specifically to investigate the murders. This unit, which operated under the broader framework of the Royal Air Force's Provost Marshal Service and eventually in cooperation with the Allied War Crimes Tribunals, began the painstaking work of tracking down every individual who had been involved in the murders. This was not a simple task. Germany, in the immediate aftermath of the war, was in chaos. Millions of people were displaced. Government records had been destroyed or hidden. Many of the men who had carried out the murders had fled, changed their identities, or were trying to melt into the general population of a defeated country. The lead investigator for much of this work was a Royal Air Force officer named Wing Commander Wilfred Bowes, and later a former detective named Harold Harrison. They worked with a dogged, methodical persistence that can only be described as extraordinary. They tracked down witnesses. They found documents that the Germans had not managed to destroy. They located former Gestapo men who were willing to talk. They cross-referenced accounts, identified inconsistencies, and slowly, painstakingly built a case against each individual who had been involved. The investigation ultimately identified more than 70 individuals who had been involved in the planning and execution of the murders. Not just the men who had pulled the triggers, but the men who had given the orders, the men who had driven the cars, the men who had arranged the official cover story afterward. The trials began in 1947. They were held under the jurisdiction of the British Royal Air Force and were part of the broader framework of Allied war crimes proceedings. The cases that went to trial resulted in convictions of 18 men. Of those 18, 13 were executed by hanging. 5 received prison sentences. But here is the part that still stings even now, decades later. Of the more than 70 individuals identified as having been involved in the murders, only 18 were ever brought to trial. Some died before they could be prosecuted. Some were never found. Some were tried and acquitted because the evidence, while strong in the investigators' minds, did not meet the legal standard required for conviction. And some were sheltered. Some of the men who had been involved in the murders ended up working for Western intelligence services in the early Cold War period, and their past crimes were quietly overlooked in exchange for whatever knowledge or capability they could provide in the new struggle against the Soviet Union. This is one of the darkest and most uncomfortable aspects of the aftermath. Some murderers escaped justice not because they were clever enough to hide, but because they made themselves useful to governments that chose to look the other way. The executions of the 13 convicted men took place at Hamelin Prison in Germany in February of 1948. The men were hanged by a British executioner. Justice of a kind was done, but it was incomplete justice and everyone involved knew it. Now let us talk about the men who survived. Not just the 3 who made the home run, but the roughly 200 men who were recaptured and returned to the camp without being murdered. The Gestapo selection process for who would be murdered and who would be returned to the camp has never been fully explained. There were criteria. Age may have been a factor. National origin may have been a factor. How high a profile an individual was may have been a factor. Some men were spared because of bureaucratic confusion, because the wrong car was sent, because a local Gestapo official made a different decision than his counterpart in another district. One of the men who was returned to the camp alive was a young RAF officer named Sidney Dowse. He had been recaptured quickly and returned before the killing orders had fully propagated through the German system. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. Another man who survived was the senior British officer at Stalag Luft 3 itself, who had not been among the escapees. His name was Group Captain Herbert Massey, and we have already talked about his efforts to document the murders. When the liberation came and Massey was finally free to speak without a German guard listening, he had extensive notes, carefully preserved, about every detail the camp had been able to piece together about the murders. The camp itself was evacuated in January of 1945, just a few months before the war ended, as the Soviet forces advanced from the east. In one of the most brutal forced marches of the entire war, the German guards forced the thousands of Allied prisoners to march westward through the middle of winter, in temperatures that dropped to -30°C, through snow and ice and blizzard conditions, with inadequate clothing and almost no food. Men died on that march. Not 50, but more than a few. Those who survived the march ended up in other camps, and eventually, in the spring of 1945, they were liberated by Allied forces. For most of them, it had been years since they had been free men. I want to spend some time now talking about the 3 men who actually made it home, because their stories are extraordinary, and they deserve to be told.
Bram van der Stok was Dutch.
He had been a doctor before the war and a pilot. He spoke German, French, and English, which gave him enormous advantages as an escapee. He had superb false papers. When he got out of the tunnel on the night of March the 24th, he made his way to the train station and calmly bought a ticket. He traveled by train, crossing Germany in stages, using his German and his forged papers to talk his way through checkpoint after checkpoint. He eventually reached the Netherlands, then Belgium, then France, and eventually crossed the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain. From Spain he got to Gibraltar, and from Gibraltar back to Britain. The journey took him 87 days. When he arrived back in Britain, he was immediately debriefed. He told the RAF everything he knew about the camp, the tunnel, and what he had seen and heard during his escape. He went back to flying. He survived the war. He eventually emigrated to the United States, became a physician in Hawaii, and lived to be 80 years old. Per Bergsland and Jens Muller were Norwegians. They had particularly good false papers identifying them as Swedish workers, and they spoke German with Scandinavian accents that would have been familiar and not suspicious to a German ear in a country that had a large population of Scandinavian workers. They traveled together, reached the Baltic port of Stettin, and managed to get aboard a Swedish ship. They sailed to Sweden and from there made their way back to Britain. Their journey took about a week. Both men survived the war and returned to Norway, where they were celebrated as heroes. 3 men out of 76. But those 3 made it. They proved that it could be done. They brought back first-hand knowledge that was immediately valuable to Allied intelligence. And more than anything, they proved that Roger Bushell's plan, as impossible as it had seemed, had actually worked for the people who made it through. The legacy of the Great Escape and the murder of the 50 is complicated and deep. In terms of its immediate military impact, the escape was, measured purely by outcomes, a failure. 200 men were supposed to escape. 76 made it out of the tunnel. Only 3 got home. The rest were recaptured. 50 were murdered. In terms of the original goal, getting men back to Britain where they could fly and fight again, the operation succeeded for 3 people. But Roger Bushell never said the only goal was to get men home. He also said that the operation would tie down German resources. And in that, it was a considerable success. The German response to the Great Escape involved the deployment of more than 5 million people. That number is staggering, more than 5 million Germans, including soldiers, policemen, Gestapo agents, railway officials, and ordinary civilians in the manhunt for the escapees. For the crucial weeks around the D-Day planning period in early 1944, Significant German internal security resources were diverted to hunting down Allied prisoners of war instead of doing whatever else they might have been doing. The operation also had a profound effect on morale. Inside the camp, the fact that it had happened at all, that 76 men had actually gotten out of the most escape-proof camp in Germany, was a huge morale boost. For the Allied public, when the story came out after the war, it became one of the defining stories of Allied ingenuity and courage. And for the German leadership, the escape was a humiliation at exactly the wrong time. Hitler's furious overreaction, the order to murder 50 men, was itself a sign of how destabilized the Nazi leadership had become by early 1944. Sober, confident leaders do not respond to prison breaks by ordering war crimes. They respond with better security measures. The fact that Hitler went straight to murder tells you something about the psychological state of the regime at that point in the war. The film version of this story, the 1963 movie called The Great Escape, is one of the most beloved war films ever made. It starred Steve McQueen, James Garner, Richard Attenborough, and a brilliant ensemble cast. It is a wonderful film, but I want to be clear about what it gets wrong and what it gets right. What it gets right is the broad outline of the operation, the tunnels, the organization, the incredible ingenuity of the escape planning, the night of the escape itself. The film captures the spirit of what happened, the determination, the camaraderie, the dark humor of men who refuse to be beaten. What it gets wrong is specific. Steve McQueen's character, Hiltz, is a composite American character who does things that no individual actually did. In reality, the Americans at Stalag Luft 3 were moved to a separate compound before the escape happened, and no American was among the 76 who went through the tunnel. The motorcycle chase, which is one of the most iconic scenes in cinema history, never happened. It was invented for the film. More significantly, the film ends before the murders. It shows the escape, the recapture, and implies a sad ending, but it does not dwell on the systematic murder of 50 men by the Gestapo. The full horror of what happened after the escape is something the film softens considerably. This is understandable. The film was made for a popular audience, and by 1963, almost 20 years after the events, there was a desire to celebrate the courage and the ingenuity rather than to dwell on the darkest possible ending. But it means that many people who know the film do not fully know the story. The real story does not have Steve McQueen on a motorcycle. The real story ends with 50 small urns arriving at a prison camp, and a group of men quietly recording the names of their murdered friends, and swearing that those names would not be forgotten. The families of the 50 went through something that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Imagine being the mother or father or wife of one of these men. Your son, your husband, went off to war. He was shot down. You got the notification that he was a prisoner of war, which was terrible, but at least he was alive, at least there was some hope of seeing him again after the war. And then you got another notification. He was shot while attempting to escape. That was all you were told. Not where. Not when exactly. Not by whom. Not under what circumstances. The official German notification was brief and cold and gave nothing. And then, after the war, the truth came out, and you learned that your son or your husband had not been shot in a fair chase but had been taken out of a car at a roadside, told to get out and shot from behind. The grief of those families was enormous and lasted for decades. Many of the families never fully recovered. Many pushed for justice long after the trials of 1947 and 1948, insisting that not enough had been done, that too many of the killers had escaped justice. In many respects, they were right. In the decades after the war, the story of the Great Escape became better and better known, partly because of the film, partly because of books written by participants and historians, and partly because the surviving veterans of Stalag Luft 3 worked hard to keep the memory alive. In the 1990s and into the 2000s, there were renewed efforts to identify and potentially prosecute some of the surviving perpetrators who had never been brought to justice. By that point, however, most of the men involved were very old or already dead. The legal and practical obstacles to prosecution were enormous. No further trials took place. The campsite itself, now in Poland, has been partially excavated and commemorated. Archaeologists have found traces of the tunnels, and the site is recognized as a place of historical significance. There is a museum. There are memorial markers. The names of the 50 are recorded there. The 3 escape tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry, were named in a specific order for a specific reason. Tom was the first to be discovered by the Germans. Dick never made it to completion as an escape route. Harry was the one that worked, the one that 76 men went through on that freezing night in March. Harry measured roughly 336 feet in total length. It was dug mostly with improvised tools, repurposed kitchen utensils, tin can scoops, and bare hands. It went 30 feet below the surface. It was reinforced with 4,000 bed boards. It had a lighting system, a ventilation system, a rail system with wooden carts to move the diggers back and forth, and a lower chamber at each end for staging. It took almost a year to dig. That tunnel was not just an engineering achievement. It was an act of defiance. It was hundreds of men saying, "We will not accept this. We will not sit quietly in our prison and wait for someone else to win the war. We will fight with whatever we have, and what we have is our hands and our minds and each other." Roger Bushell's story deserves one more moment before we draw toward our conclusion. He had been born in Springs, South Africa, in 1910. He went to Cambridge, where he studied law. He was a brilliant student and also an exceptional sportsman. He represented Britain in skiing at an international level. He was charming, magnetic, funny, and fierce. People who knew him described him as someone who filled a room the moment he walked in. He flew Spitfires in the early days of the war. He was shot down during the Battle of France in May of 1940, the dark early days when the Germans were sweeping everything before them. He was captured. He escaped. He was recaptured in Prague after the Gestapo cracked down on the Czech resistance network that had been helping Allied escapees. He escaped a second time. He was recaptured again. By the time he arrived at Stalag Luft 3, he had been a prisoner for more than 2 years. Any sensible person, or at least any person without Roger Bushell's particular combination of stubbornness and brilliance, might have decided that 3 escape attempts were enough, that the odds were too long, that the war would end eventually and you just had to stay alive and wait. Roger Bushell looked at that prison camp and started planning tunnel number 4. Or rather, he started planning tunnels number 4, 5, and 6 because of course he planned 3 at once. He organized more than 600 men. He ran a forging operation, a tailoring shop, a mapping department, a lookout network, and a tunnel engineering operation simultaneously, all in secret, all under constant German surveillance. He did all of this knowing, as he told his fellow prisoners, that if any of them were caught escaping, the Germans might very well shoot them. He knew the risk. He had been explicitly warned by the Gestapo. He did it anyway. He was shot in the back on a German roadside on March the 29th, 1944. He had been free for exactly 5 days. Roger Bushell was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable individuals produced by the Second World War. He did not win a major battle. He did not sink a ship or shoot down 100 enemy aircraft. What he did was refuse. He refused to accept imprisonment. He refused to accept helplessness. He refused to let more than 600 men sit in a prison camp and give up. He took everything the Germans threw at him, all the surveillance and the searches and the warnings, and he kept planning, kept organizing, kept believing that it could be done. That is a kind of courage that does not make the headlines the way that battlefield heroism does. But it is courage nonetheless. What lessons can we take from the story of Stalag Luft 3 and the murder of the 50? The first lesson is about the nature of evil and the importance of accountability. The men who murdered 50 unarmed prisoners of war did so because they were ordered to, because they were part of a system that had normalized the idea that orders came before conscience, and that certain categories of people could be killed without consequence. The post-war trials, imperfect as they were, established the principle that following orders is not a defense for war crimes. That principle has been the foundation of international humanitarian law ever since. The second lesson is about the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people. The men of Stalag Luft 3 were not superheroes. They were farmers and lawyers and teachers and doctors who had learned to fly and then been shot out of the sky. They were hungry and cold and far from home and had no idea when or whether the war would end. And they organized themselves into one of the most sophisticated resistance operations of the entire war. They did it with tin cans and stolen bed boards and forged papers and sheer bloody-mindedness. They proved that ordinary people, given extraordinary circumstances, can do things that would seem impossible. The third lesson is about memory and responsibility. The families of the 50 and the surviving prisoners of Stalag Luft 3 fought for decades to make sure that the story was told accurately, that the murders were not forgotten or minimized, that the names of the 50 were not lost to history. They were right to fight for that. Memory matters. The names matter. The truth matters. And the fourth lesson, perhaps the most painful, is about justice and its limits. Not all of the killers were caught. Not all of those caught were tried. Not all of those tried were convicted. Some escaped into the Cold War, protected by governments that found their skills more useful than their prosecution. Perfect justice was not achieved. It never is in cases of this scale. But the pursuit of justice, even incomplete justice, was worth doing. It established the facts. It named the killers. It said, on behalf of the world, that what happened to those 50 men was wrong, and that the people who did it were murderers. As we come to the end of the story, I want to read you the names one final time. Not the full list of 50 because we have been through that already. But I want you to hear some of these names one more time. I want you to hold them for a moment before we finish. Roger Bushell, 33 years old. South African. Lawyer. Organizer. The man who made it all possible. John Poe, 28 years old. New Zealander. Maori. A man who had crossed the world to fight for freedom. Freddie Dvorak, 28 years old. Czechoslovakian. A man who had already seen his country taken from him and still refused to stop fighting. Carol Byers, 24 years old. American. From Ohio. A man who was there because he chose to be, because he believed it mattered. Arnold Christensen, 24 years old. New Zealander. Anthony Bethel, 22 years old. British. The youngest of the 50. James Catnack, 23 years old. Australian. Dennis Cochrane, 23 years old. British. These men, and the 42 others whose names are carved into the memorial at the site of Stalag Luft 3, were not statistics. They were not abstractions. They were young men at the beginning of their lives, men who had already shown more courage and ingenuity than most people are ever asked to display, and who were murdered in cold blood by a regime that was afraid of them. They deserved better. They deserved to see the end of the war, to see the thing they had been fighting for actually arrive. They deserved to go home. They did not get to go home. But because of men like Roger Bushell, and because of the extraordinary, dogged, brilliant effort of everyone in that camp, the world knows their names. Because of the RAF investigators who spent years tracking down the killers. Because of the families who demanded the truth. Because of the historians and the filmmakers and the writers who kept telling the story. The world knows their names. And knowing their names is the very least that we can do. Roger Bushell dug a tunnel with tin cans and bedboards and sheer force of will. He did it knowing the odds were against him. He did it knowing the risk. He did it anyway. That is what courage looks like. Not in the absence of fear. Not when the outcome is guaranteed. But when you look at the barbed wire and the watchtowers and the searchlights and you say quietly, firmly, with a smile that nobody who knew him could resist, I am getting out of here. He got out. For 5 days he was free. And the world will remember him forever. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to this story. These men deserve to be remembered. And I am grateful that you chose to spend this time learning who they were and what happened to them. Please share this story. Tell someone else. Say a name out loud. Because remembering is the one thing the men who killed them can never take away.